right. Boa tarde, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Aaron Stanley. I am the CEO of Brazil Crypto Report, and I have the great pleasure today of being joined by Yat Su, who's the CEO of Animoca Brands. Yat, why don't you just give a super quick introduction to yourself and Animoca Brands, and then we'll get the discussion rolling.
Sure. My name is Yad. I'm chairman and co-founder of Animoca Brands. We're probably most known as a company that has invested in over 450 projects in Web3, although we're actually a builder operator in the space, and we believe in this concept called the shared network and digital property rights. I've been doing this now for the last 6 years, which seems really long in the space, specifically on Web3 and the open metaverse. And so if you've heard of Bored Apes, if you've heard of Sandbox, if you've heard of basically Decentraland or projects like this, Animoca has been involved in all of these.
Amazing, amazing. And again, thanks so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to have you. Yeah, it's really one of the foremost, shall I say, thought leaders and just action leaders, I guess, when it comes to really putting Web3 principles into play on the brand marketing side and just thinking through how these technologies really will affect commerce more broadly. So, yeah, I would love for you to give us an introduction of just kind of give us an evolution of how of this intersection of Web3 and branding. We had a big push in 2021 around NFTs. That we had a big boom there, and then it kind of died down a bit. Maybe give us an overview of kind of all that and how we got where we are right now.
So, I mean, markets go through cycles, but maybe it'd be good to start off with talking about how the state of NFTs and Web3 is right now. So the Web3 market today is a $2.7 trillion space. It was a $1.1 trillion space 12 months ago. NFT sales are about a $1.5 billion a month. In 21, it had roughly the same number. So it did go down in 23, but it has come straight back up, right? But it's more distributed. So whereas it was very ETH heavy as an Ethereum-based NFTs, it's now distributed between Bitcoin ordinals, Solana, as well as Ethereum. So it's kind of more distributed, more. And for instance, another aspect like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, which are treasuries and organizations run by the community. 1 year ago, there was about $12 billion run by these communities, and today it's actually $42 billion. The point I wanted to share is that the space has actually grown, but in 21 there was a lot more talk, right? It was more speculative, so you hear the noise. And in 23 you saw a lot of the building, and the effect that you have today is you actually have a very vibrant and powerful sort of Web3 blockchain market that kind of went. There's still some hype because of spot ETF, but it's not the same hype as it was in 21. 21 was a lot of noise, whereas in 24 right now, we're seeing the beginnings of all the things that people were building during the bear market emerge.
And then we saw a lot of really interesting NFT branding and loyalty experiments coming out of that period. I think notably we had a Starbucks had like a Polygon-based NFT loyalty system. And I think Nike had one that was also based on Polygon.
Artifact, yes.
And these, I mean, what have we kind of learned from these experiments thus far? As far as how are these tools most effectively used at really engaging customers?
So maybe this is a good moment for me to tee up some slides, just to explain to you how marketing in Web3 is different from Web2, and the most successful brands have used it very powerfully, whereas the less successful brands have not been able to do that. So the first thing is that when you basically have NFTs or any kind of digital asset, really, you become a stakeholder in the network. It's like a membership. And the membership means an access pass for you to basically get value from it. Now, when you think about membership in Web 2, it just gives you permission to get a discount. That's a certain kind of value. But in Web 3, it's actually a way to create a direct relationship with the brand. So brands like Starbucks did not use it that way. They just use it as a membership. It's almost like getting a piece of paper membership. And so it didn't have value. But in Web 3, actually, you want to be able to create the direct connection with the fan and create this effect of what they call the 1,000 true fan, right? And Kevin Kelly famously explained this, at Wired when he said, if you can get 1,000 true fans and they pay you $100 a year, that's $100,000 a year as a business. That's pretty good. And that was the original promise of the internet. But at the advent of Web 2, it wasn't about 1,000 true fans. It was about millions of followers, of which maybe there was only 5 fans. You didn't actually know if they were fans, because they wouldn't pay you any money. They were not actually truly your fans. So let me give you an example of what happens when you have a relationship with the true fans. And I'll start from the form of advertising. Because if you want to reach, as a brand, your customers, you have to spend money to advertise. And you spend money on Google and Facebook and those. In the gaming space where I am, we spend over $100 billion a year advertising to get gamers to play our games. And who gets the money? Facebook, Apple, Google. And how much of that money that we pay them goes to gamers, to the customers we want? How much do the money actually goes to investing in games or developing games? And the answer is nothing. It mostly sits in Ireland collecting
Yeah.
interest, right? But in Web3, you disintermediate that. And you may have heard of this thing called airdrops. And basically, instead of paying Apple and Google, what you do is you pay the customer, you pay the gamer. So Starbucks should have been giving tokens to their loyal customers to create that relationship. In the last 3 years, over $21 billion was given to customers in the form of airdrops. The biggest one being Uniswap and ApeCoin, but it doesn't matter. The point is they're paying the customers. But just think about it for a moment, right? Someone is paying money to reach you. Why don't they pay you the money to reach you? Because they know what you are, what your background is. And that's the difference about Web3. So the most successful brands, whether it's a native Web3 brand like Bored Ape, or whether it's basically someone like an Artifact with Nike or Adidas, recognize that in order to create brand loyalty and engagement, they have to give something to their fans, and they acquire it that way. And that's basically what Airdrops has done.
So let's take this conversation towards the airdrop and even just like this native token idea
Yes.
of a brand having its own native token, which is essentially what an airdrop is.
Mhm.
And there's some sort of rights attached to that token. Sometimes there is, sometimes there's not, I should say.
Yep.
And I mean, just given like the current surge in meme coin popularity that we're living through right now, like Dogecoin, Trump coin, take your pick of what coin you're interested in. And these coins have, I mean, they're intended to be like just jokes, right? In a lot of instances, some people have just written them off as not very useful. What is your view on meme coins? Like, what is the actual how do you see this all factoring into the branding equation here?
Yeah. So the way that I look at meme coins is generally like how you look at memes, right? I mean, and again, I think Dawkins best, who invented the word memes, basically described memes as essentially an idea that has the ability to spread virally, right? And so and that really to me is culture, right? When you think about the ideas that mean the most to us, well, money is an idea, it's a story. Freedom is an idea. Liberty is an idea. Democracy is an idea, right? They're actually started off as memes. And we may say that Doge and Shib and Bonk and all these things are basically jokes. And maybe that's all they are. And we shouldn't take it too seriously. But the point is, it's still a cultural moment of their time. If you had asked my mom that to buy a Birkin bag would be $30,000 or $40,000, or that a Rolex watch will be maybe worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, my mom would say, you're crazy. Because 50 years ago, you wouldn't spend that kind of money. But today you do, because they've become those cultural artifacts of their time. I would argue that Hermes or Gucci or even Adidas or Nike or, Marvel superheroes, they're all memes as well. It's just how these memes are marketed to us and different to us. If you think about the number of fashion brands that have tried to emerge, we only remember the big ones. We only remember the most successful brands, the memes that succeeded. We don't remember the 99.9% that all died that tried to do that. And that's basically what meme coins are to me as well. And some of them mean something long-term and some of them don't. But again, there are ways in which it's a translation of the culture of Web3.
And I like the handbag analogy is an interesting one, right? Because the utility of a handbag, irrespective of what brand it is going to be the exact same, right? You carry your stuff in it, and that's all it is, right? But there's a status associated with, there's a prestige associated with it, and I think that was really what drove the initial NFT adoption craze. Was you had CryptoPunks and Bored Apes that really became kind of this status symbol that people could show off. Like here in Brazil, I don't know if you all probably remember when Neymar bought a couple of Bored Ape NFTs and he changed his Twitter profile picture to a Bored Ape.
Right.
It kind of set off this big craze, right? And it becomes essentially this status symbol. But thinking, maybe pivoting back over here to just how, are we in a place where like large like Web2 platforms or companies are going to be issuing their own meme coins essentially? Is Spotify going to be issuing a coin, a loyalty token of some sort that has some value, but also some cultural representation to it as well that drives consumer engagement?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the reason why any brand should ultimately engage in Web3 You can't engage in Web3 without giving your customers, whether it's NFTs or fungible tokens. That doesn't matter to me as much as it matters that you create a direct relationship with the customer. And in blockchain, the data structure is open. So, for instance, you know if someone has a Bored Ape, that is a real Bored Ape. You can't make a fake one. But when you have a follower on Instagram, you don't know when you have, let's say, the Ferrari page. The Ferrari page might have tens of millions of followers. How many of the people who follow the Ferrari page own a Ferrari, right? And that's the problem about advertising and reach today. You have no idea, right? And some people pretend they have a Ferrari and take a photo on Instagram and say, I have one, and then you don't know, for instance. And the provenance of blockchain basically proves that you actually have a real Bored Ape. How much is it worth for you as a brand owner if you could truly target the customer that you want to reach? For instance, if you were a Ferrari owner, or if you were a Rolex owner, or if you were a Nike owner, it doesn't matter if it's expensive or not. If you knew the person who truly purchased that good, then you would spend actual much more money to acquire him. But right now, you have to do big advertising. You have to sort of shoot into the dark because they don't want you to know how to reach the actual customer. That's the whole point about Web 2, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is the difference when you go with this slide here, what I want to show. In Web 2, network effects are isolated. They're basically separated. You can't actually have a way in which you can share them. But in Web 3, all the network effects are actually co-joined to each other, which means that the power of a Bored Ape comes from the fact that when I buy one, everyone in Web 3 knows. It's not a secret. But if you buy a Rolex, only you and the shopkeeper knows. And how do you tell the world? By sending a message or sharing it on Instagram, and you don't even know if it's true, right? So it's about amplifying these network effects.
Interesting. And maybe kind of trying to tie this all together here. So I see we have kind of two parallel tracks here where you have like Web3 native companies and projects that are perhaps very good at these concepts that you're describing. You have Web2 folks that either maybe are totally disengaged or they've tried some things that have maybe been reasonably successful, like the Starbucks example. But who's going to end up? At what point do these merge? Like these two worlds merge? At what point do we see? So, or do we just, or do they ever merge? Do Web3 protocols just kind of like take over?
So my view is that Web3 protocols will take over the world completely. In fact, we think of Web3 as the next iteration of the internet. And the reason why is because so much more value shifts to the end user. Like the airdrop example. If you're an end user in Web3, I said earlier, right? Over $21 billion was given to end users in Web3. How much money has Facebook or Instagram given its users, right? I mean, it's not even a fraction. Spotify, which is the biggest platform for music, pays out about $8 billion a year to its creators, and no musician makes money on Spotify, right? So the point is that at the end, technology is built to serve a human purpose. Humans have to create value from this. If you don't create value from this, you're not going to use it. And that's, to me, is the reason why Web3 will win. So to me, it's not about it's not a Web 2 versus Web 3. To me, it's like the Web 3 will take over the world in the same way that Web 2 took over the world, right? Right? If you think about the old days when you had newspapers, we had magazine, and then the internet came about, and everyone said, oh, nobody's going to go online and read newspapers and get news this way. But the reason why Web 1 took off was not because it was a better form of medium. It's because it empowered the end user more, right? Yeah. And in Web 3, the empowerment of the web user is even bigger because you get paid for your engagement when you're online. Because you, as end users of Instagram or TikTok, you create the content, you create the value, you're creating money for them, you're creating network effects. And how much do you get paid? Nothing, right? And so in Web 3, you get paid for that because you're creating that content. You're creating the data. And so in that environment, once you understand that, why would you ever go back to Web 2, right? Why would you ever go back to an environment that doesn't respect your time? It's like if you know what your fair wages should be, you won't go to a place that treats you unfairly.
And then maybe two questions here that I'll ask at the same time here to maybe wrap up with.
Yeah.
The first one being, what do you see as maybe the most successful, really like Web3 branding exercise or a consumer engagement exercise? Would you consider airdrops to be perhaps like the most effective use case we have of Web3? I guess my criticism of airdrops is they're generally just like a one-time event, right? People are engaged up until the point where they get the token, and then they just sell the token and they move on to the next protocol to start farming their airdrop. But obviously, there's ways you can continue building that out. But would you argue that that's maybe the most successful?
I think so. I think there's a few examples, but just to touch on the topic of airdrops, to me, airdrops is really just the flipping of advertising, right? I mean, trillions of dollars are spent on advertising to reach customers. The difference is in Web3, those dollars are being spent to the end user to acquire the customer. That's all it is, right? Whether the customer chooses to sell or not, the point is this. If you're a customer, if you're a gamer, and you receive money to play a game, the chances that you are actually using that money to play the game or spend in the game is much higher. And even if you don't spend the money in this game, you'll probably spend it in another game. Whereas if you give the money to Apple or Google, they won't spend it on you at all, right? So it's very clearly that the value to an end user is better. I mean, this is what happens when you do stimulus checks, right? If the government gives you free money for stimulus, do you put it in the bank account? Or do you go to a nice restaurant and spend it in the economy? Or do you go to the movies? Or do you buy a nice shirt? The point is you start to spend money in the ecosystem because you're not thinking like basically a big platform that just wants to hoard cash. You're thinking for your enjoyment, entertainment, and culture. And that's basically what happens with airdrops. So it also brands like Bored Apes, for instance, with ApeCoin, or like Pudgy Penguins, what they've done with Walmart activations. It's another way of bringing more people into it. But ultimately, the point about Web3 is that it shares value. So you're not really in Web3 unless you're receiving value for your time.
And then this may seem like a bit of a maybe an elementary question here, but like what do consumers have to? What's the role of consumers in this whole scenario that you're describing, right? So in order for the Web3 creators to be able to get paid, or the consumers would need to have to engage in some way as well to be able to support that, right?
Yeah.
I feel like nowadays that's kind of a hard. I think there's just people are just bombarded with so many tokens and inbounds of there's different people asking for money for everything. Like, what types of consumer behavior shifts need to happen for this scenario that you're describing to actually work?
So the product still has to be good, right? I mean, just dropping a token isn't enough, right? At the end of the day, whether it's Uniswap, you're an exchange, whether it's Bored Apes as a platform, whether it's Land and Sandbox, that doesn't matter, right? You still have to have a good product. The token bootstraps your community, right? You have to think about when you launch a product. You have to spend marketing money to promote your product, and then you hope that the community comes in and likes the product and uses it. Here, you're giving the money to the community. You're bootstrapping the community that will engage in your platform, and then hopefully they use it and bootstrap it and create network effects. The role of the consumer is to create these network effects, as they do with Facebook and Google and so on, and then value forms from that. If the product is no good, then it doesn't matter if you launch a token. Right. But if the product is good, then you have longevity, as we have seen in time before.
And then just to wrap up here, what advice would you have for builders, entrepreneurs, brand marketers in Brazil and Latin America more broadly who have been either experimenting with these ideas? I see we have Hello Passos in the front row here, who's definitely one of the best out there in Brazil. Hello. And we have, there's a lot of other people who are, kind of taking, trying to get their feet wet, figure out where do I start here? And what advice would you have for folks in the region who are like, okay, I like the message this guy's sending, but where do I start?
I mean, I think Web3 is perhaps the most defining opportunity for, I think, anyone, especially in this region, particularly for young people. If you think about what's the opportunity for people under the age of 30 to basically create and have an impact in the world, I think it's Web3. It's one in which value is fairly distributed. If you think about, if you had a chance to sort of engage in the early days of the internet, what would you do? How would you engage? To me, that's the opportunity in Web3. And I think Latin America, particularly, I mean, with Sandbox, we have, over 300 people working in Argentina, basically, specifically in Latin America on products and services here, because it's a market that understands this, because, some of the currencies are not that stable. Basically, growth in the market is important. And again, I think digital property rights, you have a young population that is online all the time. They should receive value for their time. And that's Web3. And that's why I think this is a great market for it.
Amazing, amazing. Well, Yatsu, thank you so much for your time here today and sharing your thoughts. Thanks, everyone, for being here.